Now beginning. Story 1. Alewives and Abbesses, the Brewing Nuns of the Middle Ages. It's the year 1143, and the quiet hum of a Benedictine abbey somewhere in the Rhineland echoes, not with prayer but with the clatter of wooden casks, the hissing of boiling mash, and the curious scent of hops and yeast hanging thick in the chilly stone air. You might not think of a nun veiled, devoted, silent as someone who would be well acquainted with the fermentation process. But in the Middle Ages, brewing wasn't just a masculine task, nor solely the domain of the town tavern. It was, quite often, the sacred and surprisingly scientific labor of medieval religious women. And they were good at it. Beer mug why brewing ended up in the cloisters. To understand why monastic communities became centers of brewing excellence, you have to look at several rather boring but historically crucial facts about medieval life. First, potable water wasn't always safe. Rivers and wells, especially near settlements, were easily contaminated by waste and runoff. Boiling water helped, but brewing ale, a process that involved boiling, fermenting, and often flavoring with herbs, offered a safer, tastier, and more nutritious alternative. Monasteries, which grew into large, self-sustaining communities, had ample need for drinkable liquids. Nuns and monks required hydration through the day, particularly during fasting periods when solid food was restricted. More importantly, these communities often provided hospitality for travelers, fed the local poor, and ran infirmaries, all of which required ale. Brewing then wasn't just indulgence, it was public health. And the nunneries, often staffed with women of noble lineage and considerable education, had both the resources and the organizational structure to turn brewing into a disciplined art. Open book: The Rules of St. Benedict and Ale. Under the Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational text for Western monastic life, moderation was key. The rules suggested a daily allotment of wine, but in Northern Europe, where grapes were unreliable, beer and ale took their place. Nuns were expected to live modestly but practically avoiding luxury, yes, but not suffering from thirst. Ale brewing required time, cleanliness, by medieval standards, and access to good grain, all things monasteries had. They also had labor, lay sisters, novices, and servants who could be trained to handle the physically demanding parts of the work. What's often forgotten is that nuns had autonomy over their economies. Abbesses, the heads of female monastic communities, were legally allowed to manage estates, hire workers, and negotiate with merchants. If their convent brewed more ale than needed, they could sell the excess. Many did. Salt grain, hops, and economic opportunity. The brewing process itself was methodical. Grind the malted barley, steep it in hot water, let it mash and release sugars, strain the resulting wort, boil it with herbs or hops, and then ferment it. At a time when measurements were imprecise and thermometers didn't exist, brewing demanded practical skill, observation, and careful routine. In some parts of Europe, nuns pioneered the use of hops, which were still a novelty in the early Middle Ages. Unlike gruit, a mix of herbs, hops had preservative qualities, allowing beer to last longer, ideal for trade or storing through the winter. A convent that brewed well gained prestige and income. Many nunneries relied on these funds to maintain their grounds, support their charitable missions, or pay taxes to secular lords. Brewing was not just a practical skill, it was a route to independence, however limited. Records from the 12th and 13th centuries in parts of Germany, Flanders, and England show accounts of nuns ordering grain by the ton and selling barrels of ale to nearby towns. In some cases, they competed directly with male brewers or taverns, leading to occasional conflict. And yet they persisted. Sheaf of rice brewing as an act of devotion. There was something sacred about the slow, steady rhythm of monastic brewing. The process demanded silence, attention, cleanliness, and patience, virtues highly prized in religious life. To make ale that would nourish the sick or support the poor wasn't merely labor. it was service. In some convents, brewing became a kind of spiritual calling. Recipes were guarded, perfected over decades, and passed down through generations of women. Brewing wasn't done casually, it was calendared, structured into the liturgical rhythm of the year. Lesser-known saints like Saint Hildegard of Bingen, the mystic Benedictine abbess, wrote about the medicinal and spiritual properties of beer. Hildegard herself recommended hops as a healthful additive and praised beer's ability to lift melancholia. Though better known for her music and visions, she also had a hand in shaping monastic brewing culture. The veil and the vat, who were these women? Contrary to the popular image of cloistered, reclusive nuns, many women in these monastic communities were powerful figures. An abbess could hold nearly the same authority as a bishop within her domain. Some managed multiple properties, negotiated contracts, and ran enterprises. Brewing wasn't beneath them, it was often supervised directly by these women. In some cases, abbesses kept detailed records of batches, grain expenses, and profits from ale sales. These accounting books, rare survivals in damp monastic archives, show careful, business-minded leadership. Many of these abbesses came from noble families, educated from a young age and well-versed in Latin, scripture, and estate management. They were not only brewing experts but economic strategists. However, as brewing became more profitable in the later medieval period, tensions began to rise. Secular authorities, male brewers' guilds, and even bishops started to challenge the nunnery's rights to produce and sell beer. But why? Why did an activity so essential and so historically consistent begin to attract scrutiny, even hostility, by the 14th century? And what changed in the balance of sacred and secular brewing? The scent of simmering malt was once a gentle comfort in the stone halls of a medieval convent, an olfactory symbol of quiet industry. But by the 14th century, what once brought nourishment and dignity to nuns began drawing the attention of those beyond the cloister walls. As cities grew, economies matured, and trade expanded, beer, especially beer brewed by women, became a battleground. While the brewing nuns had built their practices on practicality, devotion, and community, the outside world had begun to look at their vats and casks with something far less pious: envy. Brewing turns political, the rise of guilds. By the late Middle Ages, European cities had started to consolidate power, and brewing was increasingly controlled by emerging urban guilds. These guilds, formed to protect trade interests, ensured quality standards and regulated who could brew and sell within city limits. They also protected their members from competition, and the nunneries, once seen as benevolent outliers, were now encroaching on their commercial territory. In Cologne, for instance, city brewers began to argue that convent ale was undercutting their profits. They petitioned for regulations. In some cases, nuns were barred from selling beer beyond their cloister walls. The brewing that had once helped support hospitals and poor relief now faced taxes, scrutiny, and growing resentment. Guild records from Flanders and the Low Countries show numerous complaints about unauthorized brewing, often a veiled reference to women religious. In the fiercely competitive beer markets of Bruges and Ghent, even abbesses found themselves on the defensive. The brewing nuns, once providers of sacred sustenance, were becoming economic threats. Briefcase records, recipes, and the business of brewing. Convents kept detailed brewing logs, some of which have survived, albeit fragmentarily. These logs reveal a sophisticated understanding of ingredients, fermentation times, barrel storage, and the local market. A 14th-century ledger from a convent near Nuremberg lists not just quantities of malt and hops but seasonal yield adjustments, pricing strategies, and records of tavern purchases. The nuns were not casual hobbyists. They were competitors. They brewed for feast days, lean seasons, and traveling pilgrims. They managed supply chains and contracts, In larger abbeys, they employed laypeople to manage deliveries and negotiated directly with grain merchants, some of whom favored convents due to their reliable payments and stable demand. In England, a nunnery's ale might be cheaper, but also better in quality, untouched by the adulteration sometimes found in commercial taverns. As a result, their brews often developed reputations. Some abbeys even became famous for their particular styles of ale. But these successes made them targets. Stop sign restriction and regulation, the slow squeeze. Secular authorities, often pressured by guilds or motivated by taxation, began enacting laws limiting monastic brewing. Some cities restricted the amount of ale that could be produced by religious houses. Others imposed levies on monastic sales. A few required all ale sold in public markets to be brewed under guild supervision, effectively excluding nuns. In 1373, records from Paris indicate that the Sisters of St. Elizabeth had to halt external ale sales due to pressure from both local brewers and city magistrates. Similar restrictions appeared in London, where the growing influence of male-run brewing guilds made it increasingly difficult for convents to compete. Moreover, many religious institutions were slow to adopt lobbying tactics common in the secular world. While male monasteries had more political clout, nunneries were often more vulnerable. Their relative isolation, combined with the increasing alignment between church leaders and commercial interests, made them easy to marginalize. Attention began to rise. Was the brewing nun a servant of God or an unlicensed entrepreneur? Broken heart misogyny and moral panic, women with power. At the heart of the brewing backlash wasn't just economics, it was gender. Women had long been involved in brewing, both within and beyond religious life. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, were common in villages and towns, but they too began facing hostility in the late Middle Ages. Accusations of fraud, unsanitary practices, and even witchcraft started to attach themselves to women brewers. The imagery is telling. Consider the stereotypical witch with a bubbling cauldron, broomstick, and black cat. Some historians argue that these are echoes of the alewife. The cauldron was her brewpot, the broom her shop sign, and the cat her grain-protecting companion. As women's visible roles in brewing shrank, the negative perceptions of female brewers grew. For nuns who already defied traditional gender roles, by managing property and labor, this scrutiny was doubly sharp. In sermons and satirical poems, brewing nuns were sometimes mocked as greedy or prideful. One 15th-century German text depicts a convent where the sisters are too fond of their own ale, drinking excessively and neglecting prayer. While clearly fictionalized, such portrayals reflected and reinforced public suspicion. Money with wings brewing and the dowry economy. Another layer to the brewing controversy involved the convent dowry system. Noble families often sent daughters to nunneries with substantial endowments. These funds helped maintain the institutions, but also gave them economic independence. In regions where land was scarce or heavily taxed, convents relied on brewing income to stretch dowries further. Some abbesses turned brewing into a dowry multiplier, funding not just survival but expansion. New buildings, more staff, improved gardens. This financial savvy further unsettled secular authorities. Male clergy weren't always supportive either. Bishops, particularly those looking to centralize church finances, occasionally issued edicts limiting nuns, worldly enterprises. Brewing, seen as a business, became a convenient target. By the 15th century, even sympathetic reformers began urging nunneries to reduce their commercial activities. Quiet devotion, not profitable brewing, was the new ideal. Salt, hops, and the ingredients of resist. Despite the mounting pressure, some convents found ways to resist. They shifted to smaller batch brewing, limited to in-house use. Others reclassified their brews as medicinal or liturgical, technically not for sale. A few partnered quietly with secular taverns, exchanging ale for other goods rather than cash. Some convents adapted by innovating. They experimented with salt levels to enhance preservation or used local herbs when hops were scarce. This knowledge wasn't widely published, but it was passed down orally or through marginal notes in religious manuscripts. Interestingly, these adaptations help preserve some brewing traditions that may otherwise have been lost during times of reform and standardization. In regions less controlled by urban guilds such as rural Bavaria or certain parts of Scandinavia, nuns continued brewing with minimal interference. These pockets of quiet production would become essential in preserving medieval brewing knowledge into the early modern period. Decline and dissolution. As the Reformation spread through Europe in the 16th century, many nunneries were forcibly closed. Monastic brewing operations, no matter how skilled, were shut down. In England, under Henry VII's dissolution of the monasteries, dozens of religious houses that had brewed for centuries saw their kettles confiscated, their grain stores looted, and their sisters dispersed. Some ale recipes vanished with them. A few nuns fled to continental Europe, joining surviving abbeys. There, brewing sometimes resumed, but the golden age of monastic female brewing had passed. The tide had turned toward male-dominated commercial breweries. With growing state regulation, the age of small, female-run brew operations, monastic or otherwise, was largely over. By the 17th century, the nun brewer had become a historical footnote. Her name erased from ledgers, her expertise dismissed, her contributions quite literally down the drain. But still, one wonders, what did those original brews taste like? Were they sweet, sour, herbal, spiced? What knowledge, what generations of careful observation and adaptation was lost when the final convent brewpot cooled? The final echoes of clinking wooden vats and hissing mash kettles faded from the convents of Europe long before the modern beer bottle was ever sealed. Yet, the nuns' quiet legacy, brewed in shadowed stone chambers and stirred with silent intention, never fully disappeared. Even if their names were forgotten, their influence remains lingering like the bitter finish of an old, half-remembered ale. What the nuns left behind. When the brewing nuns were displaced by Reformation, by urban guilds, or by ecclesiastical pressure, so too vanished much of the written record of their methods. Brewing, like most monastic labor, was rarely considered worthy of chronicling in its entirety. Recipes weren't passed down in neat parchment-bound books. They lived in the hands of sisters, passed from one generation to the next in quiet kitchens and warm brewhouses. Still, fragments of this world survive. A few rare manuscript notes scribbled in margins or inserted between psalms reveal mundane details. Add more water to the wort on feast days, or barley yields poor ale if milled in winter. These offhand remarks remind us that brewing was embedded in daily life, not kept in a separate book of secrets. In some abbeys that escaped the worst of Reformation or Revolution, brewing continued, often restructured as a minor domestic task rather than an economic engine. These surviving enclaves serve as the last echo of the nun brewer's legacy, a barely audible hum from the past. Scroll, a lost literature of labor. Unlike male monasteries, some of which became famous for beer production and continue to brew today, the brewing histories of nunneries were not preserved or marketed. The silence was partly structural. Women's labor was less valued and less recorded. But it was also theological. Post-Reformation ideologies, both Protestant and Catholic, leaned toward a vision of nuns as passive, prayerful, and withdrawn. The brewing nun did not fit. As printing became more widespread, male brewing guilds and monastic orders, particularly the Trappists and Benedictines, took advantage of the new medium. Brewing treatises, instructional diagrams, and business ledgers began to circulate almost exclusively authored and maintained by men. The nuns' oral traditions, confined within crumbling convent walls, had no chance of competing with the printed word. Their methods, carefully adjusted for generations, were overwritten by standardization. Their names faded. Today, we know far more about the beer preferences of medieval bishops than we do about the ale practices of thousands of industrious, capable women who lived for centuries in European convents. DNA traces in modern brewing culture. Yet something of them remains, not just in archives but in taste. Some brewing historians believe that the modern use of hops owes more to the experimental nature of female monastics than commonly acknowledged. Saint Hildegard of Bingen Abbess, mystic, composer, was among the first to write about the properties of hops in the 12th century, recommending their use in preservation. Though she is rarely discussed in brewing circles, her influence likely extended far beyond her abbey. In rural regions of Central and Eastern Europe, brewing practices continued in family kitchens and small-scale farms, often passed down by women. Whether directly influenced by the convent traditions or not, these home-based brewing cultures echoed the same spirit of patience, experimentation, and domestic adaptation. Even the term alewife, once a neutral descriptor, evolved into something more derogatory after women were largely excluded from commercial brewing. This linguistic shift mirrors the broader erasure of female labor from brewing history. But today, that silence is being questioned. Magnifying glass tilted left rediscovery and modern interest. In recent decades, brewing historians and feminist scholars have begun excavating the forgotten layers of brewing history. Research into convent archives, tax records, and ecclesiastical edicts has unearthed scattered references to brewing nuns enough to reconstruct, if not a complete picture, then at least a rough silhouette. Museums and brewing institutes have started to revisit these stories. A few experimental breweries have even attempted to recreate medieval nun ale, using available records combining ingredients like gruit, wild yeast, honey, and herbs to approximate the flavors once found in abbey kitchens. Still, the reconstructions are imperfect. Without detailed recipes or first-hand documentation, modern brewers must speculate. Did the nuns flavor their ales with fennel or mugwort? How long did they ferment? Did they favor sweetness over bitterness? Did they distinguish between small ale, low alcohol for daily drinking, and feast day brews? Every answer gives rise to new questions. And perhaps that's the point. The boring details, the kind that no one bothered to record, now present the most tantalizing historical puzzles. Compass why this history matters. It would be easy to dismiss this all as a curiosity. After all, who needs to know about nuns brewing ale 8 centuries ago? But history is made of such small, boring details. The daily decisions of people whose names we no longer remember shaped the world we live in now. These brewing nuns didn't fight wars or lead revolutions, but they fed the poor, treated the sick, maintained communities, and innovated quietly under pressure. They adapted to climate, scarcity, and persecution. They turned humble ingredients into sustenance, industry, and even a kind of spiritual practice. And in doing so, they challenge our assumptions about gender, religion, and labor. They remind us that even the most unexpected figures, cloistered women in long habits, can become unlikely experts, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Their story isn't just about beer. It's about what history forgets and what it chooses to remember. A final reflection: the ale we cannot taste. As the sun set on the brewing nunneries of medieval Europe, it wasn't just a profession that disappeared. It was a way of thinking, a fusion of devotion, domesticity, and craftsmanship that bridged sacred and secular life. What did that last brew taste like? The one made in the waning days before the convent doors were shuttered, before the mash tun was broken for firewood, and before the sisters were scattered or silenced. We'll never know. But if you listen closely, past the rustle of pages in forgotten archives, past the hiss of steam in modern breweries, you might still hear the echo of their labor. Quiet, patient, reverent. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wonder how many other silent stories lie buried beneath the foam of history. Story 2. The Papal Postal Service, how letters moved across the Holy Roman Empire. Imagine the year is 1289. A papal clerk in Rome dips his quill into dark, iron gall ink, and with careful flourish, begins drafting a letter. It is written in Latin, directed to a bishop in Cologne over 700 miles away, conveying decisions on ecclesiastical appointments, political allegiances, or instructions on matters of faith. There are no post offices, no stamps, no guaranteed delivery date. And yet the letter arrives. It travels over mountains, through valleys, across rivers swollen with spring melt, and into the hands of the intended reader weeks, sometimes months later. Hell, this is the story of one of medieval Europe's most quietly effective networks, the papal postal system, an unheralded precursor to modern mail. It was slow, dusty, and incredibly dull in the details, yet it helped hold the Holy Roman Empire, and indeed the Catholic Church itself, together. Classical: the need for a church postal system. The Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was not simply a spiritual body, it was a sprawling, administrative machine. Bishops governed territories, monasteries owed allegiance to faraway abbots, and priests needed to consult canon law in Latin volumes they couldn't afford to own. But above all, there were orders to give, disputes to settle, taxes to collect. Rome, as the seat of the papacy, became the nerve center of a massive bureaucracy. Yet the men, and occasionally women, who served the church lived scattered across a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities, subject to shifting borders and languages. If the Pope wished to exert influence, he needed more than sermons. He needed ink, parchment, and crucially movement. Thus arose the need for a postal system, piecemeal at first, and then gradually institutionalized. Person, mail, foot messengers, monks, and the limits of speed. In its earliest form, the papal postal system was improvisational. Letters were carried by foot messengers, called cursors or tabularii, young men often in minor clerical orders who could walk for days without complaint. They carried letters rolled or folded, sealed with wax and the papal ring. Speed was not the goal, reliability was. A message might take weeks, even months, to reach its recipient. Some never arrived, but many did, thanks to an ad hoc but surprisingly resilient chain of messengers, abbeys, and traveling clergy. These travelers, monks, scholars, pilgrims, were often tasked with carrying papal letters to distant destinations. They weren't full-time couriers, but they moved through Europe's slowly beaten paths with an understanding of where safety and shelter could be found. In fact, medieval letters often contained not just the message itself, but instructions for its safe passage, when to deliver, to whom, and what to do if waylaid. Some even included multiple addresses, with contingencies if the primary addressee was absent. World relay points and sacred hostels. To facilitate longer journeys, the papal curia began developing a more structured network of stations, relay points operated by monasteries, cathedrals, or papal-friendly towns. These were not post offices in the modern sense, but acted as hubs where letters could be handed off, copied, or redirected. Monasteries, especially Benedictine houses, were ideal for this task. They had scriptoria for letter copying, secure storage, and regular access to roads. These religious centers acted as unofficial postal depots. In some cases, entire orders were charged with managing mail between Rome and more remote regions. The Cluniacs, for example, maintained regular correspondence between their abbots in France and the papal court. Cistercian houses developed similar lines of communication. Letters were sometimes transported on horseback, especially during political emergencies. But horses were expensive, and most communication was still carried by foot. A diligent messenger could cover around 25–30 kilometers per day on average, depending on terrain and weather. Open book what these letters actually said. The content of papal letters varied dramatically. Some were administrative, confirming appointments, granting indulgences, or responding to complaints. Others were theological, clarifying points of doctrine, or condemning heretical views. Still more were diplomatic, written to kings, dukes, or foreign rulers to assert papal authority. A large number, however, were startlingly ordinary. Some simply requested missing tithes. Others asked for clarification on the details of a bishop's lineage or the timing of a funeral. A few were filled with complaints, long-winded grievances from abbots about monks who neglected their prayers or misused monastery wine. Papal letters used highly formalized Latin, dense and repetitive to modern readers, but this repetitiveness helped minimize confusion. In an age without envelopes, letters were often read aloud by scribes or translated for local clergy. Clear, if dull, language was vital. More interesting still, many letters were copied and stored in registries before being sent. The papal chancery in Rome maintained extensive letter books, some of which still survive. They offer a glimpse into the volume and variety of correspondence, hundreds of letters issued each month during busy periods. Locked with pen seals and security. Security was a persistent concern. Letters bore the bulla, a leaden seal with the image of Saints Peter and Paul on one side and the Pope's name on the other. These papal bulls signified official communications and were hard to forge convincingly. The use of wax seals was also common, especially for more mundane correspondence. In some regions, wax was dyed red to signify urgency. Letters were folded in intricate patterns, with string or parchment tags used to fasten them, serving both as closures and tamper indicators. Still, breaches occurred. Messages went missing, were read by the wrong eyes, or were forged outright. It wasn't uncommon for important letters to be accompanied by envoys who could deliver them directly and interpret their meaning. Some bishops even developed coded phrasing for sensitive issues, though this was rare and usually reserved for high-stakes diplomacy. In one curious case from 1311, a papal letter meant for a bishop in Bohemia was delayed for over 4 months due to a regional war. By the time it arrived, the bishop had died, and the courier had to wait weeks to confirm the identity of the successor before handing over the message. Compass the Holy Roman Empire, a postal challenge. Nowhere was the papal postal system more vital and more complicated than within the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike England or France, the empire was a fragmented collection of territories, bishoprics, free cities, and principalities. Allegiances shifted constantly. Roads were unreliable. One day a courier might pass through a friendly town. The next, he could be halted at a toll gate or questioned by bandits. Yet the Church maintained its communications across this fractured landscape. It relied on loyalty networks among bishops and abbots who kept routes safe. It employed local clergy as guides and message carriers, and it leaned on the fact that many imperial leaders, however secular, still feared papal displeasure. The empire's vastness made communication slow but not impossible. Letters from Rome to Prague or Vienna or Aachen might take 40-60 days under good conditions. For urgent matters, multiple copies were sent via different routes to ensure one would arrive. Still, weather, war, and disease could interrupt even the best-planned mail. When the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, letters from Rome dwindled. Courier deaths, closed borders, and quarantines made it nearly impossible to maintain correspondence. Some letters during this time are marked post-pestum, after the plague, acknowledging the long silence. Writing the boring but powerful infrastructure of faith. While it's easy to imagine popes and bishops as powerful men in grand robes making proclamations from on high, the reality was often quieter, more tedious, and more paper-bound. The papal postal system was built not on speed but on dogged persistence. It depended on underpaid couriers, dusty roads, and the goodwill of hundreds of local churchmen. Its success lay in its slow reliability, its willingness to embrace redundancy and patience. And though it never boasted postmarks or public mailboxes, this unglamorous network connected cities and monasteries across thousands of miles. It carried not just doctrine and decree, but complaints, disputes, appointments, and news. Without it, the Church could not have functioned as a transnational authority. Without it, the papacy might never have survived the schisms, revolts, and reforms of the centuries to come. But how did this early, fragile system evolve into something more organized? Who finally took the haphazard letters of Rome and began turning them into a formalized European postal service? And what role did merchants, emperors, and even Renaissance artists play in transforming religious mail into something truly modern? By the dawn of the 15th century, the papal postal system, once reliant on itinerant monks, dusty abbeys, and ecclesiastical good, found itself outpaced by the very forces the Church had helped ignite. Trade routes were expanding, cities were swelling, literacy was slowly spreading beyond clergy, and communication, though still painstakingly slow, was no longer solely the concern of the religious elite. As the needs of church and state alike grew more complex, a transformation began. The papal curia's quiet network of letters, seals, and messengers gave way to something altogether more ambitious, a nascent European postal infrastructure that would connect emperors and merchants, popes and bankers. And at the center of this shift were two unlikely forces: commercial interests and the peculiar, fragmented geography of the Holy Roman Empire. Merchants and the need for speed. Commerce was the engine. As medieval markets grew into international fairs and banking houses emerged in cities like Florence, Milan, Bruges, and Augsburg, information became more valuable and more perishable. Merchants needed to know the price of wool in Ghent before deciding what to sell in Venice. Bankers needed news about sovereign defaults, famine, or war before approving loans. And guild leaders needed updates from royal courts to anticipate tariffs or restrictions. The result: a growing class of laymen who began to build their own courier networks, often repurposing the same roads, inns, and abbeys that the papal messengers had once used alone. These merchant-run message systems were faster because they were incentivized by profit rather than piety. They operated in parallel to church channels, sometimes even competing with them. But the Church, ever pragmatic, began to piggyback on them. Post office entered the taxis family, the Habsburgs' mailmen. One name dominates the story of Europe's early modern postal development: the taxis family, later known as the Thurn Untaxis dynasty. The taxis originated in Lombardy but rose to prominence in the service of the Habsburgs, who ruled the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. In the late 15th century, the family was tasked with creating a courier system to connect the empire's scattered territories. The challenge was immense. From Vienna to Brussels, Prague to Madrid, the empire's land sprawled across unpredictable terrain and unstable political borders. And yet, the taxis succeeded by organizing an unprecedented network of postal relays. They divided long routes into short segments, stationed fresh horses and riders at inns and waypoints, and implemented regular schedules for departures. Letters could now move continuously, day and night. A journey that once took 3 weeks by foot might now take just 6 or 7 days by horseback relay. The system was a revelation, and the Church noticed. Black a curious alliance, Rome and the imperial post. Although the papal curia initially maintained its own internal mail routes, it soon began partnering with the imperial post for broader delivery. By the early 16th century, papal letters to and from the empire often traveled through taxis-run routes. This marked a shift from a cloistered, religiously managed communication system to one increasingly dependent on secular logistics. It was no longer a monk with a satchel walking through alpine passes. Now it was a professional courier, mounted, uniformed, and carrying dozens of sealed dispatches, some sacred, some commercial. And this evolution wasn't without its complications. For the church, outsourcing communication meant surrendering some control. Delays, intercepts, or even espionage became real risks. But the benefits outweighed the costs: faster delivery, broader reach, and the ability to interact with the increasingly interconnected world of Renaissance Europe. Receipt: a world of letters, bureaucracy expands. As this new postal infrastructure took hold, the volume of letters exploded. The Vatican Chancery became a hub of clerical labor, employing scores of scribes, translators, and archivists. Letters were no longer hand-copied one at a time. They were duplicated using block printing, and eventually, the printing press, though always in tightly controlled contexts to preserve confidentiality. One might assume that these letters were grand in tone and purpose, but much of the papal post was again tediously administrative. Confirmations of bishopric elections, disputes over tithes from obscure parishes, requests for relics or permission to canonize local saints, responses to disputes between monastic houses over boundaries or vineyards. These letters rarely sparked wars, but they were essential to maintaining the Church's vast web of authority. And thanks to the new postal system, the Church could exert influence in places it had long struggled to reach. Even obscure villages in Saxony or border towns near modern Switzerland began receiving instructions and occasional reprimands from Rome with greater regularity. Book scriptoria in silence, the forgotten scribes. While the broader postal network professionalized, much of the labor behind it remained invisible, particularly the scribes. Inside papal offices in Rome, scribes were tasked with translating, composing, and copying letters for dispatch. Their work was monotonous but essential. Often educated in monastic or university settings, they worked long hours copying Latin formulae, checking orthography, and preparing duplicates for the archives. They rarely signed their work, few were remembered. Yet it was their ink-stained hands that kept the papal presence alive in distant lands, and it was they who preserved records that, centuries later, allow historians to trace the growth of communication itself. Some letters contain marginal notes, sent via taxi's route or delayed by winter snow. Others contain red marks indicating urgency or annotations about responses. They are small clues, quiet testaments to a vast, paper-based bureaucracy that operated long before email or air freight. Open mailbox with raised flag the other side, receiving papal mail. So what happened when a papal letter arrived? In many cases, it was read aloud in cathedral chapters or monastic assemblies. Illiteracy was common, and public reading ensured the letter's contents were properly conveyed. In towns, copies might be posted on church doors or announced by clerics. Some letters came with demands, changes to liturgy, tithes owed, or news of excommunication. Others brought honors such as indulgences or relics. In politically tense regions, a letter from the Pope could either stabilize or provoke. One curious tradition in some bishoprics involved reading papal letters in Latin and then translating them into the local vernacular, usually by a second cleric who had no role in the initial delivery. This helped prevent falsification or misreading. The act of receiving mail was ritualized, even performative. Seals were inspected, wax was saved. In some places, the letters were kept in metal chests along with other ecclesiastical documents bound not by legal necessity, but by reverence. Candle challenges, fraud, delay, and disruption. Even with improved infrastructure, the system had flaws. Fake letters occasionally circulated, especially during periods of papal schism. Rival claimants to the papacy each issued decrees, confusing local clergy. Some unscrupulous individuals forged indulgences to collect fees. Others intercepted letters to learn political secrets. Delays remained common in winter or during outbreaks of conflict. Wars disrupted postal stations. Horses died. Roads flooded. Plague made some towns impassable. To hedge against these risks, senders often dispatched multiple copies of important letters along different routes. This redundancy, a hallmark of the medieval mind, allowed for flexibility in an uncertain world. And through it all, the network adapted. A turning point approaches. By the mid-16th century, as the Protestant Reformation spread and the 30 Years' War loomed on the horizon, the political landscape of Europe grew even more complex. The postal systems, once largely ecclesiastical, were now entangled with royal courts, merchant banks, and imperial politics. The papal post had laid the groundwork, but its future no longer belonged solely to Rome. It belonged to the broader web of power, profit, and printed information. Letters once carried only by monks now traveled beside trade invoices, military instructions, and love poems. So what became of the Church's role in this vast communication system? Did the papal post survive the upheavals of the Reformation and the wars that followed? Or was it finally absorbed quietly and completely into the emerging machinery of the modern state? The sound of hooves faded from the alpine paths. One by one, the ancient waypoints that once saw papal letters arrive by dust-covered messengers grew silent. In some, inns were shuttered. In others, monks were forced out by flames of reform. The papal seal, once a mark of reverence and command, was no longer welcome in many corners of the Holy Roman Empire. The Reformation had come, and with it, centuries of laboriously built communication infrastructure, slow, imperfect, resilient, was challenged, redirected, and in some cases, deliberately destroyed. The papal postal system, once the quiet thread connecting Rome to a fragmented Christendom, entered its final phase as the world shifted around it. The Reformation disrupts the mail. The Protestant Reformation, sparked in 1517 by Martin Luther's publication of the 95 Theses, fundamentally reshaped the relationship between church and society. Suddenly, papal letters weren't just unwelcome, they were suspect. In Protestant regions of the empire, receiving papal correspondence became politically dangerous. Bishops who remained loyal to Rome risked confiscation of lands. Monasteries were dissolved. In many cities, letters from Rome were no longer delivered. Papal messages were publicly burned or ridiculed, their seals mocked. Courier stations once maintained by monasteries were dismantled. Local clergy, many of whom now aligned with Protestant reformers, refused to act as papal intermediaries. The Church's letter routes, so reliant on ecclesiastical networks and goodwill, fell apart. In place of unity, fragmentation returned. Even the mighty Thurn Untaxis courier system, now serving the Holy Roman Emperor and various royal courts, had to navigate a precarious balance. It transported messages for Catholic and Protestant factions alike, but papal mail, increasingly, traveled under stricter scrutiny. What had once been a shared communication framework between church and empire now became a contested channel of influence. The role of the Counter-Reformation. Yet the papacy did not simply recede. The Counter-Reformation, Rome's response to the spread of Protestantism, brought renewed efforts to maintain Catholic networks. The Council of Trent, 1545–1563, produced vast amounts of correspondence, decrees, instructions, commentaries. These documents needed to reach Catholic bishops, parishes, and universities across Europe. To ensure this, the papacy increasingly relied on diplomatic channels and emerging national posts. The shift from internal monastic infrastructure to formal diplomatic couriers became permanent. The letters themselves changed too. Where earlier papal mail might focus on appointments or tithe collection, post-Trent correspondence was doctrinal, strategic, and defensive. It carried liturgical reforms, argued for orthodoxy, and coordinated resistance against heresy. But it also carried something subtler, a realization that papal communication would never again move as freely through the empire. Closed mailbox with raised flag emergent of state postal systems. The 16th and 17th centuries saw the rise of state-run postal systems that began to replace religious or private networks altogether. Rulers realized that the ability to move information quickly and reliably was a tool of governance. The French royal post was expanded. England's Tudor monarchs used postmasters to consolidate control. The Habsburgs extended the taxis network into the Spanish Netherlands. In these systems, papal letters, once among the most important documents on the road, were now just one of many types of correspondence. They waited in queue behind trade invoices, diplomatic updates, or royal missives. Even in Catholic territories, the Church's dependence on secular infrastructure increased. Letters now bore not just papal seals, but often required approval or inspection by state censors. Rome continued to send mail, but it no longer controlled the roads. Scroll archives and memory. Despite the loss of control, the papacy did something quietly brilliant. It preserved its past. In the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly the Archivum Secretum, thousands of letters, scrolls, and registers from the medieval postal system were cataloged and stored. These included copies of letters sent to every corner of Europe, records of messengers' routes and costs, inventories of correspondence delayed by weather or war. These archives, still studied by historians today, offer a rare glimpse into the unglamorous workings of an enormous medieval bureaucracy. They contain disputes over monastery walls, pleas for papal dispensations, and the ink-traced marks of 1,000 minor miracles of coordination. The mundane nature of these records is their strength. They show how the papacy governed not by decree alone, but by persistent, letter-bound presence. A bishop who received a letter from Rome was reminded, "You are seen, you are expected to respond, you are part of something larger." Even when faith fractured, the administrative impulse endured. Package the last messengers. By the 18th century, the papal postal system as it had existed in the Middle Ages was gone. The last of the monk messengers had either been absorbed into national posts or reassigned to other clerical duties. The stations that once served as relay points became redundant. Sealed letters still arrived in faraway dioceses, but they now traveled on carriages maintained by secular powers. And yet some of the habits remained. Bishops continued to read papal letters aloud. Seals were still inspected. Copies were still made for archives. In the Vatican, a small team of scribes, no longer monks, but trained bureaucrats, continued to process outgoing mail, maintaining the long tradition of Latin formula and careful record-keeping. It was the same rhythm, only quieter. Thought balloon: why this matters. The quiet power of paper. So much of medieval history is dominated by war, plague, and politics, that it's easy to forget the quieter machinery that made civilization function. The papal postal system, in all its tedium, was that machinery. It was the lifeline of the Church's governance, the subtle glue that held together far-flung clergy and communities. It is tempting to romanticize it, but in truth, it was a world of aching feet, muddy roads, repetitive Latin, and slow, deliberate action. And in that slowness, there was something deeply human. A message sent from Rome might take weeks to arrive, but it arrived. And in a world without phones, internet, or mass media, that was enough to shape minds, settle disputes, and create the illusion of unity across a chaotic continent. What remains? Today, when a pope tweets or gives a televised address, We forget how recently such direct communication became possible. For most of the Church's history, words from Rome traveled slowly, folded in parchment, kissed with wax, and carried across dangerous roads. The modern postal service, the very idea of scheduled communication, owes much to this forgotten infrastructure. The papacy didn't invent mail, but it showed how consistent communication could build authority, bind communities, and endure disruption. So the next time you receive a boring letter, an invoice, a tax form, a notice from some far-off institution, consider the lineage. It might just trace back to a barefoot monk, walking across the Alps, carrying a sealed message from the eternal city. Story 3. A spoonful of porridge, the daily diet of a 13th century peasant. Close your eyes and picture the past. Not kings or castles, not knights or plagues, but something quieter, the slow bubbling of a pot over a smoky hearth, a wooden spoon scraping against the bottom of a bowl, the soft thud of a bread loaf being torn, shared, chewed. This was the real rhythm of medieval life, not sword clashes or coronations, but meals. And for the average person in 13th century Europe, especially in the countryside, the daily diet was a monotonous, repetitive, and deeply humble affair. It was porridge more often than not. Bread and beans, boiled greens, and the occasional bit of cheese or ale. Meat, if it came at all, was rare. This story is not about the feasts of kings. It is about the food of everyone else. The vast majority of medieval people, peasants, villeins, serfs who worked the land, paid their tithes, and survived on what they could grow, barter, or glean. The centrality of grain, why cereal was king. In the 13th century, grain was the foundation of nearly every meal. Oats, barley, rye, and wheat formed the backbone of the medieval diet. But not all grains were equal, and not everyone had access to the same ones. Wheat, prized for its softness and lightness, was expensive and often reserved for the upper classes or for festival days. For the average peasant, daily bread was coarse, dark, and dense, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with ground peas or beans to stretch it further. And when even bread was too costly or time-consuming, there was always the fallback, porridge. Made by boiling grain with water or, rarely, milk, porridge was a cheap, filling, and endlessly flexible staple. It could be salted or sweetened, left plain or thickened with onions, leeks, or bits of garden greens. It was eaten at dawn, at dusk, and often cold by midday. Children grew up on it. Elders relied on it. There were few other options. Bowl with spoon morning meals, the first bite of the day. Contrary to modern ideas of breakfast, most medieval peasants ate their first meal mid-morning after several hours of work. In the early light, they would rise, tend to animals, gather firewood, or begin work in the fields. Only after that would they eat. This first meal was often simple. A piece of stale bread softened in warm ale. A wooden bowl of porridge, reheated from the night before. If available, a bit of soft cheese or cold vegetables from yesterday's pot. Porridge, in particular, was made in large quantities and left over the fire to stay warm throughout the day. It could be eaten multiple times, slowly thickening and souring as the day went on. Occasionally, a spoonful of honey or chopped apple was added when the harvest had been good. But for most, this first meal was about sustenance, not pleasure. It was fuel for the body, nothing more. The flavors of survival, what grew in the garden. While grain was the core, the medieval peasant diet was supplemented by whatever could be coaxed from the land. Common vegetables included onions and leeks, often used as the base for soups and stews. Cabbage, hardy and long-lasting. Turnips and parsnips, root vegetables that could be stored through winter. Peas and broad beans, cheap, protein-rich, and easy to dry. These were not seasoned with spices, those were expensive and largely out of reach. Instead, flavor came from garlic, mustard seeds, vinegar, and wild herbs like nettle or sorrel. Cooking was done over open hearths, in iron pots suspended by hooks or chains. Meals simmered slowly, and the goal was often to stretch ingredients as far as possible. Stews, called pottages, were common, changing slightly with each addition. Leftovers were added back to the pot, day after day, creating a continuous, ever-evolving meal, sometimes affectionately called perpetual stew in later centuries. Cheese wedged dairy, eggs, and occasional luxuries. Though meat was rare, dairy products were more available, especially for families with livestock. Milk, however, spoiled quickly, so it was often transformed into butter when surplus allowed. Buttermilk used in cooking and baking. Curds and whey for soups or cheese making. Hard cheeses, which lasted longer and could be stored for winter. Eggs were gathered when chickens were kept, though many peasants gave eggs to their lords as part of feudal dues. What remained was eaten sparingly, often on Sundays or holy days. On very rare occasions, meat made an appearance: a salted herring, a strip of bacon, or a bit of blood sausage. These were precious and often tied to the church calendar or feasts. But more often, the taste of meat came only in the form of broth or wishful thinking. Beer mug drink, ale, water, and thin beer. Clean water was not always guaranteed, especially in larger settlements. Wells could be shallow or polluted, and running water where it existed might also serve as a latrine. Thus, ale became the drink of choice. This was not the strong, frothy beer of today, but a low-alcohol, small beer made from barley or oats. It was weak enough to drink in quantity but strong enough to inhibit bacteria. It provided hydration, modest calories, and sometimes a bit of comfort. Children drank it. Elders drank it. Ale was brewed in small batches by women, either for household use or to sell locally. It was often unfiltered, cloudy, and sour. Other beverages included cider in apple-growing regions, mead where honey was abundant, rare, herbal infusions, sometimes used for health. Wine was generally out of reach. It was expensive, imported, and associated with the church or nobility. Baguette bread, holy days and feasts, breaking the monotony. The medieval calendar was dotted with feast days and fasting periods, both of which altered the usual eating routine. Feast days, though rare, allowed for special meals. A pig might be slaughtered, pies might be made, or ale might be brewed stronger. Communal meals were common, and even the poorest villagers might enjoy a piece of meat or a slice of fruit tart. Fasting days, on the other hand, forbade meat and sometimes dairy. These were observed out of religious obligation and often required creative substitutions like almond milk for the wealthy or fish-based stews. For the peasant, such days didn't always bring drastic changes. Their diet was already so limited that fasting simply meant eating the same food, but with slightly fewer options. Still, these days brought a break from routine and a reminder of the larger rhythms of the religious year. Abacus, the economics of eating. The diet of a 13th century peasant was shaped as much by obligation as by agriculture. Feudal dues often required villagers to give a portion of their harvest grain, eggs, butter, cheese to the local lord or church. This meant that even in good years, much of what was produced had to be given away. As a result, the food left for one's own family was whatever remained after rent had been paid in wheat, not coin. Bad weather, poor harvests, or livestock illness could mean real hunger. And when famine came, as it often did, even the poor porridge pot might go empty. Many peasants supplemented their diets with foraged foods: mushrooms, wild berries, nuts, even nettles or acorns processed to remove bitterness. These were not luxuries, they were necessities. Food, in short, was work. Repeat button, a life of repetition. What's most striking about the medieval peasant diet isn't its lack of variety, but its reliability. You woke up to bread. You ate porridge by noon. You sipped ale by night. You shared boiled greens, soured cheese, and maybe a pickled egg. You chewed the same bread made from the same flour, ground by the same miller, baked in the same oven as you had the day before. And you thanked God for it, because the alternative was hunger. Food was rarely flavorful, never extravagant, but it sustained life. It allowed the body to bend, dig, sow, and reap. It kept children growing, kept elders moving, and kept entire communities working. It wasn't exciting, but it worked. Yet beneath this life of monotony and necessity, one wonders, what did these meals feel like? What stories were told around the fire as porridge bubbled? How did people gather, eat, and share even when there wasn't much to go around? And in a world of scarcity, how did food become more than just sustenance? How did it become comfort? In the 13th century village, food was never just eaten, it was shared, stretched, and sacred. It bound people to the land, to each other, and to the seasons. But to understand how medieval peasants truly experienced food, we must move beyond ingredients and into the texture of their lives. What did a meal look like when cooked on an open hearth? What were the rules spoken and unspoken of who ate what, when, and how? And how did the simple act of eating together give shape to a world where survival was often a daily concern? To answer these questions, we step into the smoky interior of a timber-framed home, built with wattle and daub, where food is not only necessity, but ritual. The hearth at the heart of the home. The hearth was everything. Set in the center of the house, usually a single room shared by a family, and their animals, the hearth provided heat, light, and the means to cook. There was no chimney. Smoke rose and filtered out through gaps in the roof, blackening timbers and lungs alike. Hanging above the hearth was an iron pot, blackened from use. This was the vessel of life, where meals were boiled and reheated daily. A wooden ladle rested nearby. Bread hung from hooks to dry. A jug of ale sat on a crude table, warm from proximity to the fire. This scene, though unremarkable, was repeated in thousands of homes across Europe. It was the stage on which the daily drama of eating and surviving played out. Seating, sharing, and social order. In the medieval household, meals reflected social structure, even in the humblest settings. The father or male head of household typically sat near the fire or at the head of the table, if a table existed. Older children sat next, followed by the youngest and servants. Women, especially mothers, often ate last after serving others. Meals were communal, but hierarchy was never absent. The idea of private meals didn't exist. Everyone ate together, from the same bowl if necessary. Large wooden trenchers or bowls were shared between 2 or more people. Spoons were common, but forks were rare or unknown. Hands were used, carefully and deliberately. A communal pot or dish sat at the center, and bread served as a utensil used to scoop or soak. A piece of bread was also placed near the fire to dry and harden, making it suitable for later use as a trencher or plate. Meals were quiet affairs, not occasions for debate. Talking was allowed, but etiquette even among peasants valued moderation and respect for the food. Prayer marked the beginning and end of the meal. A simple blessing of thanks was whispered, or sometimes sung. Herb flavoring the bland. Without imported spices, peasants turned to local herbs and plants to add flavor if they had the luxury. Common flavorings included leeks and garlic, both affordable and pungent. Parsley, sage, thyme, grown in small gardens. Vinegar made from spoiled wine or fruit, adding acidity. Salt, precious and often taxed, used sparingly. Fermentation also played a key role. Pickled vegetables, sour bread, and ale added sourness and bite to otherwise bland fare. Cheese, especially if aged, could enhance the flavor of pottage. But most meals were unseasoned. The point was not to impress but to nourish. Tear off calendar the cycle of the seasons. Seasonality dictated everything. In spring, meals might include fresh greens, wild garlic, sorrel, young nettles. Lambs were born but rarely eaten, kept for wool and milk. Spring was also a lean time, as winter stores dwindled before summer harvests. Summer brought berries, cherries, and more fresh greens. Beeswax and honey, though rare, could be gathered. Bread was more plentiful. Autumn was the most bountiful. Apples, onions, grain harvest, dried peas, and the annual slaughter of pigs. Hams were salted and hung. Beans were shelled and stored. Cabbage was pickled. This was the time for feasting, often marked by local saints' days. Winter was hard. Bread was dark and coarse. Porridge thickened from necessity. Pickled vegetables and dried legumes became mainstays. Some turned to acorn flour or chestnuts when grain ran low. The rhythm of meals mirrored the rhythm of survival. Pig feast days, the rare and the remarkable. Though everyday meals were humble, feast days offered something different, brief moments of abundance. Weddings, church festivals, and saint days were occasions for community-wide meals. Lords might sponsor a feast for tenants, offering roasted meat, white bread, and strong ale. Peasants contributed what they could: a handful of eggs, a bit of flour, a jug of cider. Boiled meats were preferred over roasted ones, cheaper, easier, and suited to large pots. Pies made from minced meat, dried fruits, and fat might be shared. Fish, if caught or purchased, became the centerpiece during Lent or holy fasts. These meals were memorable not only for the food, but for the rare sense of leisure they brought. For a day the hunger was forgotten, songs were sung, bread was broken. Balance food and obligation, who owed what? Feeding one's family in the 13th century wasn't simply a matter of farming. It was a matter of paying dues. Under the feudal system, peasants owed their lords portions of grain, eggs, butter, cheese, and even chickens. These goods were delivered on specific days, often recorded in manorial rolls. Failure to provide could result in fines or worse. The church also demanded tithes, 1/10 of produce, theoretically voluntary but socially enforced. The best of the harvest often went to God, leaving the rest to be stretched. Some peasants managed small surpluses and sold food at markets, but most lived harvest to harvest, praying for mild weather and enough left over to make it to spring. Hunger was always a season away. Fire hunger, the ever-present threat. Even in good years, the line between enough and not enough was thin. Crop failure due to frost, flood, or pestilence could ruin a village. Grain prices soared. Bread shrank. The pottage pot ran dry. Mothers skipped meals for their children. Weeds became food. Bark was sometimes ground and mixed into flour. Famines like those of 1272 or 1315 devastated rural communities. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them vulnerable to disease. Records from manorial courts show increases in theft, desperation, and flight during such times. The peasant diet, while consistent, was not secure. Food was life, and life was fragile. Food and faith. Despite the harshness of their world, food had spiritual meaning for medieval peasants. Meals began with prayer and ended with thanks. Fasting was seen as holy. Sharing with the poor, though difficult, was a Christian duty. Bread, especially, was sacred. To waste it was sinful. To break it with others was grace. The church taught that Christ was present in bread and wine. Every Mass reminded villagers that simple food could become divine. Even in the humblest homes, the act of eating was a moment of reflection, of humility, gratitude, and communion. Final thoughts on the table. What did it feel like to eat in the 13th century? To sit on a wooden bench, surrounded by family, the pot steaming at the center of the room. To dip bread into thin stew and chew slowly, knowing this might be the best meal for days. There was no garnish, no plates, no variety, but there was presence, attention, even dignity. Food connected the past and future. It was the one constant in a life of toil. Still, questions linger. What happened to these food traditions as the medieval world began to change? How did the coming of trade, plague, and urbanization alter the peasant diet? And would the next century bring comfort or catastrophe to the wooden bowl at the center of the hearth? The fire still flickered in the hearth, the pot still simmered, but by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, something was shifting. Europe was growing, towns were expanding, trade routes were lengthening, more goods flowed into markets, and with them came new ingredients, new tastes, and new possibilities. But alongside growth came hardship. Famine, disease, and war began to reshape life at the most basic level, the level of the table. The diet of the peasant, once predictable, seasonal, and shaped almost entirely by the land, began to evolve, sometimes out of opportunity, but often out of sheer necessity. What was once a spoonful of porridge became a symbol of survival, of adaptation, and of a world on the cusp of profound change. Trade, markets, and the arrival of new foods. By the end of the 13th century, local markets were more common, especially in areas connected to trade routes or larger towns. Peasants living near these hubs had greater access to goods provided they had coin or something to barter. Some of the changes were modest but meaningful. New vegetables like spinach and carrots, cultivated in more distinct varieties, appeared. Dried fruits like raisins and dates became accessible, though still expensive. Spices such as pepper, saffron, and cinnamon trickled in, sold by weight and often hoarded for festival cooking. These foods were rarely part of the daily peasant diet, but they filtered into awareness. Recipes passed down orally began to include notes like, "If pepper can be afforded," or "Add spice for weddings." More significant was the slow shift from purely subsistence living to occasional participation in the money economy. Some peasants sold cheese, ale, or eggs. A few rented land to merchants. With coin in hand, they might purchase salt or dried fish to enhance their meals. Still, most peasants remained bound to the land. Their diets, for all the trade goods flowing through Europe, stayed grounded in porridge and bread. But the seeds of change were sown. The Great Famine of 1315, 1317. Then came the rains. In the early 14th century, Europe suffered one of the worst famines in recorded medieval history. The years 1315 through 1317 were marked by incessant rain, failed harvests, and widespread hunger. Grain sprouted in the fields before it could be harvested. Livestock drowned or starved. Mold and rot set in. The result? Bread became scarce. Prices doubled, then tripled. Peasants ground bark into flour, boiled weeds, even resorted to eating seed grain meant for spring planting. Chroniclers speak of entire villages living on green things, nettles, grasses, boiled roots. Starvation wasn't just a fear, it was a fact. Families who once ate 3 modest meals now ate 1. Communal stews thinned to broth. Children died. Elders went without. Entire communities unraveled. The humble daily porridge, so boring, so constant, became the last defense against death. When even it disappeared, the collapse was total. Though the rains eventually ceased, the trauma lingered. Memory of famine remained etched in the habits of eating. Food was hoarded, meals eaten slowly, leftovers never wasted. The peasant table would never feel quite as secure again. Skull the Black Death, empty chairs at the table. Just decades after the famine, Europe was struck by another catastrophe, the Black Death. In 1347, the plague arrived. By 1351, it had killed between 30–50% of the population. Whole villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. Churches went silent. And yet, for the survivors, something paradoxical happened. With fewer people to feed, more land became available. Wages rose. Landowners desperate to find laborers offered better terms. Some peasants improved their diets for the first time in generations. Bread became whiter, meat became slightly more accessible, milk and eggs returned to the table. Markets, no longer overcrowded, provided better prices. This golden age of the peasant didn't last long, but it marked a distinct moment in food history. For a brief time, the daily diet improved, not because of abundance, but because of absence. Food remained simple, but it was enough. And for those who had known only hunger, that was extraordinary. What the peasant table became. By the late 14th century, a slow, uneven transformation had taken place. Peasants, especially those in more prosperous regions of England, France, and the Low Countries, were eating better bread made with a higher ratio of wheat, more consistent dairy, especially soft cheeses and buttermilk, occasional meat, usually pork or salted fish, improved vegetables, thanks to better farming tools and crop rotation. The table itself changed, too. Furniture, once minimal, became more common in prosperous homes. Instead of crouching by the hearth, families gathered at rough wooden tables with benches. Trenchers' thick slices of stale bread were still used, but ceramic bowls became more frequent. Meals were still shared, still humble, but they were slightly more comfortable. And in the rhythm of those meals, the clatter of spoons, the ladling of stew, the tearing of bread echoed the resilience of those who had endured famine, plague, and labor. Books, the influence of religion and reading. One unexpected shift in the peasant diet came not from trade or plague, but from religion. The late medieval period saw an increase in religious piety among laypeople, many of whom joined confraternities or engaged in devotional reading. Manuscripts and early printed texts encouraged fasting, temperance, and simplicity. Some peasants, especially those influenced by monastic ideals, began to fast voluntarily, emulating the saints. Others adopted more structured meal patterns, aligning their food with spiritual goals. Food became not just a survival mechanism, but a reflection of morality. To eat modestly was virtuous. To avoid meat on Wednesdays and Fridays was holy. To share one's bread was to imitate Christ. Even among the illiterate, these values were passed orally, preached from pulpits, shared around hearths. Thus, even as diets improved, a tension remained between abundance and abstinence. The porridge pot, ever present, became a symbol not of poverty alone, but of faith, discipline, and humility. Sunrise, the end of the medieval meal. By the early 15th century, the diet of the European peasant had changed, but not drastically. Bread, porridge, beans, and boiled vegetables still dominated. Meat remained rare. Cheese and ale remained familiar. The structure of meals, morning, midday, evening, remained intact. But the world was different. The plague had redrawn maps. Trade had redrawn markets. Literacy had reshaped consciousness. And the act of eating, once solely about survival, was slowly becoming something more. Peasants began to think about what they ate. They experimented when able. They remembered famines past and planned more carefully. They preserved more food, salted more meat, dried more beans. The wooden spoon, the clay bowl, the shared ladle, these objects became heirlooms not just of necessity, but of continuity. Reflection, what we can learn. The medieval peasant's diet is easy to romanticize or pity, but to do either misses the point. Their meals were not bland because they lacked imagination, but because they understood restraint. Their routines were not dull because they lacked options, but because they valued consistency. And their survival was not inevitable, it was earned, day after day, meal after meal, spoonful after spoonful. We often think of history as battles and borders, but it's also porridge, bread crusts, cold stew, a quiet prayer before a shared bowl. These are the textures of real life, the boring, essential, nourishing moments that history too often overlooks. So the next time you eat something simple, a slice of rye bread, a bowl of oats, pause and think of the hands that stirred, shared, and survived with nothing more than that. Story 4. The Salt Tax Revolts, How Minerals Shaped Medieval France. In the silence of a village kitchen in 14th century France, a woman reaches for a pinch of salt only to find the jar empty. It's not simply a matter of taste. Without salt, she cannot preserve the fish her husband has just brought home. She cannot brine vegetables. She cannot season the pottage. And she cannot afford to buy more. The price is too high, the tax too steep, the law too strict. What was once a humble mineral, drawn from the sea or the earth, had become a symbol of injustice, sparking unrest from the Loire to the Pyrenees. Salt was essential. Salt was controlled. And in medieval France, salt was taxed with such severity and imbalance that it sparked one of the most quietly disruptive series of revolts in French history. This is the story of the Gabelle, the salt tax, and how it transformed a common seasoning into a political powder keg. Salt. Why salt mattered. To understand the power of the salt tax, we must first understand salt itself. In the medieval world, salt was not a luxury, it was survival. Before refrigeration, salt was the primary method of food preservation. Meat was salted and dried. Fish were brined and stored for winter. Vegetables were pickled with salt water. Even cheese relied on salting. Without salt, a family could not prepare for lean months. A village without salt could not store enough food to survive poor harvests. It was as essential as bread. But while salt was necessary, it was not equally available. France had saltworks along the Atlantic coast and some inland mines, but transport was expensive. Distribution was difficult. Control over supply, therefore, meant power. And the French crown knew it. Crown. The origins of the Gabelle. The Gabelle, France's infamous salt tax, did not begin as a permanent institution. It was first introduced in 1286 under King Philip IV as a temporary wartime measure to fund military campaigns. It worked. Salt was in constant demand. People had no choice but to pay, and so the tax stayed. By the 14th century, the Gabelle had evolved into a system of state monopolization. The crown controlled salt production and distribution, setting prices and requiring every household to buy a minimum quantity per year at a fixed, inflated rate. It was more than a tax, it was a mandate. In some regions, households were legally required to purchase between 7–10 kilograms of salt annually, even if they didn't need it. Failure to comply led to fines, imprisonment, or worse. This wasn't taxation, it was enforced consumption. World. A patchwork of privilege. What made the Gabelle especially resented was its inequality. France was divided into zones with different salt laws. Pays de Grande Gabelle, areas with the harshest enforcement and highest prices. Pays de Petite Gabelle, areas with lower rates. Pays exempts, areas exempt from the salt tax altogether, often border regions or former independent territories with preserved privileges. This patchwork created immediate resentment. A peasant in Languedoc might pay twice what a neighbor in Brittany paid. A merchant in Anjou might pay a salt price 10 times higher than someone across the Rhone. And so, salt smuggling became a way of life. Detective. The rise of the salt smuggler, faux-saunier. By the early 14th century, a new figure emerged in French society, the faux-saunier, the illegal salt dealer. These smugglers bought salt in tax-exempt zones and transported it secretly into high-tax areas. They were often peasants, fishermen, or small traders simply trying to survive. The crown, unsurprisingly, cracked down. Salt smuggling was treated as a serious crime punishable by heavy fines, branding, or forced labor on royal galleys. Gabelle officers, known as gabelets, were granted sweeping powers to inspect wagons, homes, and markets. But smuggling continued. In some villages, entire communities protected local faux sauniers. Informants were shunned. Gabelists were ambushed. It became more than a crime. It became resistance. Salt the economic strain on peasant life. For the French peasantry, the salt tax was not an abstraction, it was a daily burden. Imagine this. You are required to buy 8 kilograms of salt at the king's price, even if your family needs only half that. You must walk several miles to a royal salt storehouse, called a grenier à sel. You must carry the salt back, sometimes under escort, to ensure compliance. You cannot share or resell the surplus. Doing so is illegal. If your child is born, your salt quota increases. If you are widowed, it does not decrease. And when the crown needs more revenue, the quota grows again. In many rural households, salt took up a disproportionate share of income, rivaled only by grain and bread. Families cut back on other goods to meet their salt obligation. In poor years, it meant hunger. In this context, salt was no longer simply food. It was oppression in granular form. Scroll early protests and local revolts. By the mid-14th century, small acts of rebellion began to surface. Villagers staged demonstrations at greniers à sel. Local officials were petitioned for reductions. Smugglers were hidden in barns and attics. Fires were set to salt warehouses. Salt clerks were pelted with stones or dung. Most of these protests were spontaneous, small bursts of fury without centralized leadership, but they were persistent, and they revealed a widening rift between the crown and its subjects. Salt had become political. Compass the strategic importance of salt revenue. Why didn't the crown relent? Because the gabelle worked. It funded wars, paid royal debts, and filled state coffers. In some regions, salt revenue made up 15–20% of local tax income. By the time of Charles V. R. 1364–1380, the gabelle was entrenched as a pillar of fiscal policy. And the state's need for money only increased with the 100 Years' War against England dragging on, and with growing administrative costs. Even royal officials admitted the tax was unpopular, but they argued that it was better to burden the peasantry with salt than to risk noble rebellion through land taxes. Salt, they reasoned, was reliable until it was. Crossed a prelude to future revolutions. The salt tax may not have caused a revolution on its own, but it taught the French people how to resist. The infrastructure of opposition smuggling networks, coded language, safe houses would reappear in later centuries. The language of protest rights, fairness, freedom from arbitrary taxes found early expression in the gabelle resistance. And when the French Revolution finally came in 1789, one of its earliest acts was to abolish the salt tax. But in the 14th century, that was still centuries away. At the time, the gabelle seemed permanent. Its injustice seemed inescapable. And yet, even then, voices were rising, quiet at first but insistent. Because behind every grain of salt in a peasant's stew was the memory of cost and the seed of rebellion. Still, what would happen when protests grew louder? When local anger turned into regional uprising? Could a kingdom as vast and complex as France really be threatened by something as ordinary as salt? Salt does not burn, but in 14th century France it sparked fires nonetheless. The gabelle had been quietly resented for decades, its unfairness noted, its burden endured. Yet by the late 1300s and early 1400s, a tipping point was reached. The everyday act of buying salt, so vital, so routine, became intolerable. The whispers turned to shouting. The smugglers were no longer hidden but protected openly, and some villages, pushed too far, began to organize. This wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was something France hadn't seen before on this scale: coordinated, region-wide resistance from the poorest layers of society. And the crown would respond, not with reform but with iron. From grumbling to revolt. The first major salt-related revolts began in earnest during the 1380s, though smaller incidents had dotted the countryside for decades. The spark, a combination of war taxation, rising prices, and increasing enforcement of salt quotas. In Anjou, Poitou, and parts of Languedoc regions burdened with the Grand Gaibel, villagers began refusing to collect their assigned salt rations. In some towns, grenier as cell buildings were attacked. Salt clerks fled or were assaulted. In others, angry crowds intercepted shipments of salt headed to royal depots. They seized it, divided it amongst themselves, or threw it into rivers. The language of rebellion emerged. Words like justice, oppression, and liberty, rare in peasant mouths, became common. In 1382, in the wake of growing economic strain and resentment over salt taxation, an especially fierce uprising erupted in Rouen. Though salt was not the only cause, it played a central role in the grievances. This revolt, and others like it, would come to be known under a single, evocative name: the Révolte des Maillotins. The Maillotins revolt, urban fury meets rural grievance. In March 1382, the city of Rouen, one of France's largest and most economically significant towns, exploded in revolt. Citizens armed with maillots, large wooden mallets, stormed the city's tax offices, destroyed accounting records, and killed several royal officials. Their anger had simmered for years, fed by grain shortages, heavy war taxes, and yes, the hated Gaibel. Word of the uprising spread quickly. Within weeks, other cities joined in. Paris saw its own unrest, with mobs attacking Gaibel agents and salt depots. Caen, Amiens, and Orleans witnessed similar violence. Even smaller villages followed suit, burning tax barns, refusing payments, and organizing watch groups to protect against Gaibeless salt enforcers. These weren't spontaneous outbursts. Some uprisings involved careful coordination. Messages were sent, leaders were chosen, tools were hidden in advance. The Gaibel, once an administrative measure, had become a symbol of royal injustice and a focal point for collective action. Balanced royal reaction, repression over reform. The crown's response to the salt revolts was swift and severe. In Rouen, Charles VI's government sent in troops to retake the city. The rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency. Dozens of rebels were executed publicly. Others were imprisoned or fined. The city's privileges were revoked, and new garrisons were stationed. In Paris, the authorities executed supposed ringleaders and imposed heavy financial penalties. The Gaibel was reaffirmed unchanged. If anything, enforcement became stricter. The logic of the crown was clear: concession would signal weakness. Yet this approach only deepened the resentment. Even in defeat, the rebels gained something powerful: a sense of shared struggle. Stories of the uprising spread, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and traveling clergy. Salt became a common thread in complaints, sermons, and peasant songs. Children heard tales of how their parents had once struck back. The resistance didn't end, it simply changed shape. Salt the smuggling underground expands. With open rebellion punished, discontent retreated into the shadows. Smuggling, already common, became widespread. Entire families became faux-sauniers. Children served as lookouts. Women hid salt beneath clothing or in baskets of laundry. Farmers hollowed out tool handles to carry contraband. In towns near tax-exempt zones, black markets flourished. Salt was sold in alleyways, in bakeries after dark, or from hidden compartments beneath market stalls. Authorities responded with more surveillance. Informants were paid. Border posts increased. Punishments grew harsher. First-time offenders might be fined and imprisoned. Repeat offenders faced branding, often a letter S on the shoulder. Persistent smugglers could be sent to the galleys or executed. And yet the smuggling continued. For many, it was not just a livelihood, it was a moral protest. Receipt salt as a symbol of broader injustice. As the 15th century progressed, the salt tax remained, but so too did the memory of resistance. For peasants and townsfolk alike, salt became shorthand for broader suffering. It represented a tax imposed from above, with no local input. It symbolized a government that took more than it gave. It reminded people that even life's basics could be weaponized against them. In some parts of France, references to salt crept into local legal charters and petitions. Communities begged for exemptions or reductions. Local lords sometimes shielded their tenants from gabelle agents either out of pity or political strategy. In these quiet acts of resistance, the slow formation of a more politically conscious public can be seen. The people had not forgot the mallets in Rouen. Counterclockwise arrows button cycles of protest. Throughout the 15th century, salt-related protests flared periodically. In Guyenne and Languedoc, riots broke out when salt prices rose again. In Bordeaux, locals resisted new gabelle officials sent from Paris. In Provence, peasant leaders issued proclamations denouncing salt quotas. Though few of these resulted in major political changes, they wore down the state's authority in the countryside. In some cases, the cost of enforcing the gabelle outweighed the revenue it generated. But the monarchy refused to abolish the system. The gabelle had become too intertwined with the machinery of governance. Removing it would mean rebuilding the financial foundation of the state. And so the tax remained, so did the resentment. Scroll what the gabelle revealed. By now, the salt tax was more than an economic policy. It was a mirror. It reflected the centralizing ambitions of the French monarchy, the deep inequalities between regions, classes, and communities, the limits of top-down control in a vast, diverse kingdom, the ways in which even the most mundane commodity could become politicized. Perhaps most importantly, it revealed that the peasantry so often dismissed in royal circles could act, organize, and resist. Their tools were not just pitchforks and mallets, but memory, rumor, and refusal. They could not vote, they could not write laws. But they could refuse to buy salt, and they did. Still, one wonders, if salt could spark such sustained defiance, what would happen when the people finally demanded not just cheaper salt, but full control of how they were governed? Would France, centuries later, still remember these early rumblings? And what role would salt play in the final fall of the old order? It began as a simple pinch of seasoning, but by the eve of the French Revolution, salt had become a symbol of injustice, of inequality, and of everything that was broken in the ancient regime. The gabelle did not just survive the 14th and 15th centuries, it entrenched itself, it grew, and it continued to quietly shape French life for generations. But what started as scattered resistance in medieval villages would, by the 18th century, become one of the loudest demands of the revolutionaries. And as the Bastille fell and the monarchy unraveled, the old salt tax system would become one of the first casualties. This is the final arc of the salt story, the long, bitter aftertaste of a policy that touched every pot and every peasant for centuries. The gabelle in the early modern state. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the gabelle had evolved into a massive bureaucratic system, one of the most complex and loathed in Europe. Under Louis XIII and Louis XIV, the administration of the salt tax was formalized and expanded. Royal officials were stationed in towns to monitor purchases. Enforcement was more centralized, with surveillance extending into rural regions. Special salt courts were established to prosecute smuggling and tax evasion. Fines, jail terms, and branding were common punishments. Salt was no longer just bought, it was registered, tracked, and enforced. It had become state property until sold through official channels. Entire professions emerged to support the system. Gablers, tax collectors. Inspecteurs des Gabels, salt inspectors. Archivists du sel, record keepers of salt quotas. And all of it was deeply unpopular. Salt daily life under a national gabel. For ordinary people, the system meant constant intrusion. A typical French peasant family in the 17th century might be required to buy up to 7 kilograms of salt per adult each year, even if they didn't need or want it. They couldn't share it with neighbors. They couldn't trade it. They couldn't even carry it without documentation proving it had been purchased legally. Salt jars in kitchens came with hidden compartments. Barrels were double-bottomed. Women baked salt into loaves to smuggle it past tax guards. These weren't hardened criminals. They were families trying to preserve pork, brine cabbage, or stretch fish for winter. And every use of salt, every sprinkle carried the weight of law and punishment. Balance growing criticism and legal challenges. As Enlightenment thinking spread in the 18th century, intellectuals and reformers began to challenge not just royal absolutism, but also the minutiae of its governance, including taxation. Writers and philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Turgot criticized the gabel as unjust and inefficient. They argued that it penalized the poor while allowing the rich to avoid hardship, encouraged widespread law-breaking, undermining respect for the state, created a vast and wasteful bureaucracy, produced little actual revenue relative to its cost. Even within the monarchy, some ministers proposed reform or abolition. But the crown, heavily indebted and facing mounting fiscal pressure, refused. The salt tax, for all its flaws, remained a dependable source of revenue, especially because the burden fell on those least able to resist. That resistance, however, was changing. Firecracker from smuggling to revolution. By the mid-18th century, salt smuggling had become an open secret. In some regions, gabel officers were regularly assaulted. In others, entire villages collaborated to evade inspections. Trials for salt violations clogged the courts. And still, the crown insisted. In 1775, under Louis XVI, a renewed push to enforce the gabel more strictly sparked riots in multiple provinces. The people had had enough. So when the Estates General convened in 1789, and representatives from across France gathered to draft lists of grievances, cahiers de doléances, the gabel appeared again and again. In province after province, from Burgundy to Brittany, the salt tax was denounced in writing. It was cited not just as an economic injustice, but as a symbol of all that was wrong with royal governance. And when the French Revolution began that same year, the gabel was among the first feudal impositions to fall. Abolition and aftermath. On March 1, 1790, less than a year after the storming of the Bastille, the French National Assembly officially abolished the salt tax. Salt was declared free, smugglers were released, warrants were canceled, salt depots were emptied and burned. The act was met with cheers in towns and villages across the country. It was more than a policy change, it was a moral victory. At last, the humble mineral that had shaped peasant life for centuries was unshackled. For the first time in generations, a family could salt their food without fear. Compass lessons from a grain of salt. The history of the gabel offers more than an account of taxes and rebellion. It offers a slow, detailed map of how power functions and how ordinary people resist. It teaches us that injustices don't always spark immediate revolution. Sometimes they simmer, grain by grain. Bureaucracy, when untethered from compassion or fairness, breeds resentment. Small things like salt can carry immense symbolic weight. Resistance often begins in kitchens, in marketplaces, in the quiet refusal to comply. The gabel was a tax, but it was also a test of legitimacy. And ultimately it failed. Salt final reflections, salt as history. When you shake salt on your food today, it's easy to forget that entire governments once tried to control that gesture, that people once died for it, that whole economies were built and broken around it. But in the France of centuries past, salt was not just seasoning, it was currency, power, and for many the edge of survival. It bound meat, preserved vegetables, and paid for wars. It stirred protest, inspired smuggling, and shaped a revolution. And so, the story of the salt tax, though granular and seemingly mundane, becomes a lens into how ordinary people, pushed too far, can begin to imagine something better. It starts not with speeches, but with spoons. Story 5. Monastic Laundries, the Quiet Rebellion of the Washer Monks. In the early morning quiet of a Benedictine monastery, long before the bells ring for prime, a small group of monks is already at work. They are not copying manuscripts or tending vines. They are bending over stone troughs, scrubbing woolen robes and linen habits in cold water made cloudy with soapwort and ashes. Steam rises as buckets are hauled and garments thumped. It's a rhythm as old as the monastery itself, wet, methodical, and humble. This is the lavatorium, the monastic laundry. It was here, in these overlooked quarters, that one of the lesser-known stories of medieval resilience played out. The quiet, enduring labor of monks assigned to washing, drying, and maintaining the clothing and linens of entire religious communities. But the story of the monastic laundry isn't just one of hard work. It's a story of order, resistance, and adaptation. For even within the walls of the cloister, supposedly sealed from the outside world, conflict could bubble up like lye in a washpot. Basket the daily reality of monastic cleanliness. In the popular imagination, medieval Europe is often pictured as filthy. But in monastic communities, cleanliness, while limited by the era's tools and knowledge, was taken surprisingly seriously. Clean clothing was a marker of discipline, spiritual order, and dignity. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by many monasteries across Europe, made provisions for bathing and laundering, especially in warmer seasons. Monks, particularly in larger or wealthier houses, had multiple robes, some for labor, some for worship. Undergarments called subligacula were worn under habits and changed regularly, at least by monastic standards. All of this required washing, and in communities with dozens, sometimes hundreds of brothers, that was no small task. So who were the washer monks? Laundry was not performed by all monks equally. Just as some were assigned to cook, farm, or copy texts, others were designated to care for clothing and linens. These lavators, or washer monks, were usually lay brothers, conversi, men who had joined the monastery not as full choir monks but as laborers. They took vows, wore habits, and lived under the same rules, but they focused on manual work rather than liturgy or learning. Their domain was the lavatorium, often a separate building or dedicated space near running water. Here they maintained tools, soap made from rendered fat and ash, wooden paddles for beating cloth, vats for boiling water, and ropes strung for drying. They worked in silence as required by the rule, but their labor was noisy splashes, thuds, scrubbing, ringing. It was tiring, wet, and unceasing. Some monasteries hired outsiders to assist poor women from nearby villages or hired servants, but many relied entirely on in-house labor, coordinated with the same discipline as prayer. The tools of the trade. Monastic laundries were surprisingly sophisticated for their time. In fact, some of the earliest plumbing and drainage systems in Europe were developed for religious institutions. Key tools included ash lye soap, made by soaking ashes in water and collecting the resulting alkaline liquid. Soapwort, a plant used for its natural suds when agitated in water. Boiling vats, large pots used to sanitize cloth, especially undergarments and linens used in the infirmary. Fulling troughs, used for heavier garments like habits, which were often made from undyed wool and required beating to clean. Drying yards were laid out with precision, often protected by walls to prevent theft or contamination. In winter, drying was done indoors over wooden racks near fires, though this risked smoke damage. In many cases, monks developed detailed laundry schedules. Garments were washed weekly or bi-weekly, with larger loads coordinated around feast days or seasonal changes. Clean robes were expected for major liturgical events. Fresh linens were prepared for guests, the sick, and dying. Nothing in a monastery was done casually, not even laundry. Balance cleanliness and spiritual discipline. Why all this effort for laundry? In monastic thought, physical cleanliness was not mere vanity. It symbolized inner purity, spiritual readiness, and detachment from worldly filth. The rule of St. Benedict allowed for frequent bathing in warmer months, especially for the sick and elderly. While full baths were rare, washing hands, faces, and feet was routine, especially before prayer and meals. Clean habits reinforced this discipline. Furthermore, monks were meant to live simply but not squalidly. Their labor was a form of devotion. To clean another's garment was to serve both man and God. This philosophy extended to infirmaries. Monasteries often cared for the ill and dying both from within and from local villages. Linens were washed carefully to avoid miasma, the then believed source of disease. Monks assigned to infirmary laundry bore the dual burden of physical and spiritual hygiene. But not all monks agreed with how this labor was distributed. Fire tensions within the cloister. Over time, the laundry became a source of quiet tension within some monastic communities. Choir monks, those devoted to prayer and scholarship, often viewed physical labor as spiritually valuable in theory. But in practice, they were hesitant to participate in the grimiest tasks. Laundry, especially involving soiled undergarments or infirmary linens, was left to lay brothers or servants. Some conversely resented this division. Letters and chronicles from the 12th and 13th centuries show glimpses of frustration. In one Cistercian house, lay brothers complained about insufficient help during winter washing. In another, a conflict arose when choir monks demanded cleaner robes for Easter without contributing to the laundry effort. Occasionally, disputes escalated. Laundry was sabotaged. Soap stores went missing. Routines were disrupted as a form of passive protest. This was the cloister's quiet rebellion, not of banners and bloodshed, but of delayed clean robes, damp habits, and unwashed linens left conspicuously on choir benches. Yarn adapting through innovation. To ease tensions and increase efficiency, some monasteries innovated. In Cluny and Monte Cassino, elaborate water channels were built to bring clean spring water to lavatoriums. Heated stones were used to warm water for winter washing. Wooden ringers, early mangles, and even primitive washboards began appearing by the 14th century. Monks developed recipes for better soap, combining rendered animal fat with herbs to mask unpleasant smells. Some abbots introduced rotating schedules. Even choir monks were occasionally assigned to help with simple laundry tasks, especially during Lent or Holy Week. These changes did not eliminate hierarchy, but they smoothed relations. In many cases, they allowed monastic laundries to run with near-industrial efficiency, cleaning dozens of robes per week, along with bedding, towels, and altar cloths. By the late Middle Ages, laundry in major monasteries was no longer an afterthought. It was a respected, if unglamorous, operation vital to daily life. Still, one wonders, what happened to these washer monks as monastic life changed? Did the Reformation and monastic dissolutions wash away their roles entirely? Or did their quiet discipline leave traces in the laundry routines we take for granted today? Laundry, like prayer, is a rhythm. Each week, the monastic washer monks followed a steady cadence, soaking, scrubbing, boiling, drying, folding. Their world was defined by fabrics and ash, not parchment and pen. Yet, as the late medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and Reformation, even the humblest routines would be shaken. In this section, we move from the cloister to the current of change sweeping across Europe, from monastic reform and ecclesiastical power, struggles to the political and theological revolutions that reshaped how monks lived, labored, and laundered. The Cluniac and Cistercian laundry divide. By the 12th and 13th centuries, two of the largest monastic orders, Cluniac and Cistercian, had developed distinct approaches to communal life, including their treatment of labor and cleanliness. The Cluniacs, based in Cluny, Burgundy, emphasized elaborate liturgy, beautiful architecture, and artistic refinement. Their laundries were spacious, and their use of laborers, including outside servants, was expansive. Washer monks were part of a larger support system that kept the Cluniac liturgical machine pristine. The Cistercians, on the other hand, were reformers. They believed monastic life had become too luxurious. They returned to manual labor as a core value, insisting that monks themselves, not hired help, should perform all necessary work. This meant that Cistercian washer monks held more responsibility and often more pride in their work. Some even left behind rudimentary notes about techniques, soap formulations, and seasonal washing strategies. Yet tension still arose. As monasteries grew, expectations did too. One Cistercian abbey in Flanders by the mid-13th century was laundering over 120 habits per week, straining even the most devoted lay brothers. Thread when cleanliness becomes protest. Not all monastic laundries operated in harmony. In times of internal division or institutional decay, even laundry could become a battleground. In one recorded dispute from a Carthusian house in the late 1300s, washer monks began withholding clean habits from choir monks who failed to contribute to communal labor during harvest season. The act was subtle, but pointed. Elsewhere, some washer monks began sewing small, hidden marks into garments, a thread cross, a stitched line to distinguish who had supported the laundry work and who had not. These symbols were largely ignored by abbots, but created informal hierarchies within the monastic community. These weren't revolts in the traditional sense. They were quiet expressions of dignity, asserting that physical labor was as valuable as spiritual contemplation. The fire hazards of soap and heat. As monasteries experimented with larger and hotter washing methods, dangers emerged. Soap making involved boiling animal fat with ashes, creating a thick, caustic mixture that could easily boil over or ignite. In wooden buildings heated by open hearths, this posed real risks. In 1428, the monastic laundry at a Benedictine abbey in eastern France caught fire when a large soap kettle was left unattended. The resulting blaze destroyed not just the laundry, but the adjacent dormitory wing. Records suggest it took over a year to rebuild, and during that time, monks washed clothing in the nearby river, often through holes cut in the ice. This incident and others like it led some monasteries to move laundries away from living quarters, building freestanding stone washhouses with fireproof roofs. These structures, often ignored by tourists today, were once vital centers of daily life. Of the influence of female monastic communities. Though male monasteries receive more attention in historical records, female religious houses also maintained rigorous laundry routines. In convents, the work of laundering was typically performed by the nuns themselves. In wealthier convents, young novices were often assigned laundry duties as part of their early formation. In poorer houses, it became a lifelong task for some sisters. Interestingly, convent laundries developed several innovations. herbal rinses. Convents often cultivated herb gardens, and some nuns experimented with rosemary, lavender, and mint in rinse water to improve smell and reduce lice. Communal bath days. Certain Benedictine nunneries scheduled monthly cleansing days where laundry and personal washing occurred together, often paired with communal readings or silent meditation. Embroidery and mending. Laundries became sites of repair and even artistry. Some nuns used this time to embroider initials or subtle symbols into their own linens. This dual labor, both spiritual and domestic, challenged later Protestant reformers' assumptions that nuns were idle or detached from real work. Cross the Reformation and the collapse of cloistered routines. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in the early 16th century, brought upheaval to nearly every facet of monastic life, including laundry. Martin Luther's 95 Theses questioned not only theological doctrines but the very legitimacy of monastic vows. As reform swept across Germany, England, Switzerland, and beyond, many monastic houses were seized, dismantled, or abandoned. With them went the laundries. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 led to the closure of hundreds of abbeys and priories. Washhouses were left to rot or were repurposed as farm buildings. In German lands, monastic laundries were sometimes torched during uprisings. Others were quietly taken over by local communities. In Scotland, some former nunneries were converted into hospitals, with their laundries continuing to serve public health needs well into the 17th century. The washer monk, once a fixture of cloistered life, vanished in many parts of Europe, their rhythms broken, their troughs dry. Yet not everywhere. The persistence of the routine in Catholic regions. In staunchly Catholic regions like Spain, Italy, and parts of France and Poland, monastic laundries survived and even evolved. By the 17th century, some religious orders began integrating new tools and ideas into laundry work. Wooden wringers, imported from the Low Countries. Soap blocks crafted from olive oil in southern Europe. Rainwater collection systems for soft washing. The Jesuits, known for their educational and missionary zeal, also documented methods for sanitation and clothing care during overseas missions. Laundry, in this context, became part of public health. Meanwhile, washer monks, now sometimes assisted by novices or even orphans, continued their work. They left few writings, but their routines endured. The lavatorium was no longer just a place to scrub robes. It had become a site of continuity, an anchor of daily rhythm, even as the world changed. Still, we might ask, what happened to the wisdom of the washer monks when monasteries declined? Did their silent methods disappear, or did they seep into village laundries and hospitals? And might their legacy, quiet, rhythmic, resilient, still echo in the way we clean and care for others today? The steam has long since dissipated. The stone basins are dry. The soap kettles are cold. Yet the story of the washer monk does not end in silence. Though the grand monasteries faded or fell, and their cloisters emptied over time, the routines and quiet resistance of their laundries found new life in surprising places. Hospitals, almshouses, convent schools, and even modern laundry cooperatives. This final section follows the legacy of the lavatorium from the fall of the cloistered laundries through their reinvention in secular institutions, all the way to the unnoticed echoes in our own habits of hygiene and care today. The architecture that remained. When monastic institutions were dissolved, whether by Protestant reformers, revolutionary governments, or Napoleonic seizure, their buildings often found new uses. Many former monasteries were converted into military barracks, prisons, asylums and hospitals, boarding schools, agricultural centers. The laundry facilities, once central to monastic life, were rarely preserved for their own sake, but their robust, water-ready architecture made them ideal for reuse. In England, former Benedictine laundries were repurposed as infirmary washrooms in 19th-century workhouses. In Spain and Italy, old lavatoriums became parts of charitable hospitals and orphanages. Their tiled floors, drainage channels, and water access remained useful even if the washer-monk was long gone. Yarn the rise of secular washer communities. As the Enlightenment era gave way to industrialization, a new wave of laundry workers emerged, mostly women, often poor, and largely invisible in the public record. Yet the echoes of monastic laundry practice remained. Many urban hospitals and orphanages in the 18th and 19th centuries borrowed directly from monastic precedents. Washing schedules, uniform standards, and hygiene routines all bore traces of Benedictine and Cistercian discipline. In France, the Daughters of Charity, a lay Catholic order, took over many of the laundry operations once handled by monks. Their founder, St. Vincent de Paul, emphasized service through practical labor, including washing clothing for the sick and poor. In Germany and Austria, washer sisters formed informal guilds based around church hospitals. Some even reclaimed old monastery washhouses as their headquarters. Thus, the washer monk's rhythm did not disappear. It was transferred, adopted, adapted, and feminized in a new age of service. Industrialization and the erosion of ritual. By the mid-19th century, industrial-scale laundries were rising in major European cities. Machines began replacing hands. Steam replaced muscle. Laundry was no longer communal, devotional, or even particularly personal. It became a service one measured by volume and speed, not rhythm or reflection. Still, the ethos of carefulness and order lingered in certain places. Institutions that maintained religious affiliations, convent schools, church-run hospitals, missionary outposts, continued traditional laundry practices well into the 20th century. Some even trained girls in monastic-style laundry discipline as part of domestic instruction. It was during this period that old monastery techniques were quietly cataloged by curious antiquarians and reformers. Recipes for lye soap made from sheep fat. Notes on cloth classification, woolens, linens, silks. Records of seasonal drying methods, including indoor hearth drying in winter. Prayers or meditative verses written by washer monks, meant to be recited in silence. These records were often filed away, forgotten, or dismissed as women's work or medieval trivia. But they preserved something precious, a glimpse into the care that defined centuries of daily service. Sponge hidden rituals in modern life. Today, we no longer beat our linens against stones or boil robes in fire-warmed vats. Yet the remnants of monastic laundry linger in quiet ways. Consider the weekly wash. The idea of a designated laundry day, still common in many households, descends from monastic scheduling. Hospital hygiene. The focus on clean linens and antiseptic garments in medical care has roots in monastic infirmary practices, where washer monks boiled linens for the sick. Uniform care. Schools and military institutions that require pressed, clean uniforms often follow procedures first codified in monasteries. The laundry room. In many older European buildings, communal laundry rooms are tucked away near water sources, echoing the placement of monastic lavatoriums. Even the impulse to wash away the week, or reset with clean sheets, carries a kind of spiritual residue. It's not just cleanliness, it's renewal. Counterclockwise arrows button, rediscovering the washer monk. In recent years, historians of daily life have begun revisiting overlooked professions, particularly those defined by manual, repetitive labor. The washer monk has begun to reemerge in scholarly circles. In museum, exhibits on monastic hygiene. In studies of labor divisions within cloistered life. In feminist reinterpretations of spiritual service through domestic work. These explorations paint a richer, more nuanced picture of medieval life. They challenge the old assumption that the cloister was only about prayer, study, and rule. It was also about water, steam, stains, and cold hands. And in that picture, the washer monk becomes not just a laborer, but a symbol of quiet endurance. Final reflections, the sacred in the ordinary. What made the washer monk remarkable was not innovation or drama, but constancy. They scrubbed when others prayed. They labored in silence. They cared for fabric so others could appear before God unblemished. Their work was cyclical, invisible, and essential. In many ways, it mirrored the turning of the seasons, the cycle of monastic bells, the renewal of the soul. In the age of instant spin cycles and chemical detergents, it's easy to forget that laundry was once devotional. That cleanliness was a sign of respect, dignity, and shared purpose. But perhaps in some quiet way, when we fold clean linens or hang a robe to dry, we echo 1,000 silent rituals. The rhythm persists even if we no longer hear the bells. Story 6. The Guild of the Neitzel Men, Urban Waste and Hidden Power. You are walking the narrow, crooked streets of a bustling 18th century city. It is midnight. The oil lamps flicker weakly. The pubs are finally quiet. And then you hear the clatter of wooden wheels, the heavy steps of boots, the sound of iron scraping against wood. The Neitzel men have arrived. These are the laborers who move through cities under the cover of darkness, removing human waste from privies, cesspits, and chamber pots. They are the unseen janitors of empire, keeping the streets relatively clean, the smells moderately bearable, and the system barely functioning. Their job is disgusting, dangerous, vital, and somehow also lucrative. Welcome to the world of the Neitzel men, a forgotten guild whose story winds through sewers, social stigma, and the foundations of modern sanitation. Toilet. What was Neitzel? Before underground plumbing and flush toilets, human waste didn't just disappear, it accumulated. In the medieval and early modern period, urban dwellings had chamber pots or privies, rudimentary toilets that emptied into a cesspit or open trench. In rural areas, it was manageable, but in cities, population density created a mounting problem. By the 1600s and 1700s, cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam were brimming with cesspits. These weren't just foul, they were dangerous. The pits could overflow, leak into wells, attract rats, and spread disease. Some exploded from the buildup of methane gas. Others simply collapsed. To keep this system going, cities developed an informal but vital profession, the Neitzel man. They were responsible for emptying cesspits and hauling the waste known euphemistically as Neitzel out of the city. Often, it was sold as fertilizer to nearby farms. But this work had to happen at night, for obvious reasons. Hammer. Tools of the trade. The tools of a Neitzel man were simple but grim. A long-handled shovel or scoop, often reinforced with iron. Thick leather gloves, rarely washed. A honey bucket, a strong container, usually wooden or tin-lined. A cart, usually with solid wheels to handle unpaved, rutted streets. The men themselves wore rough clothing, sometimes oiled or tarred to resist seepage. Some tied herbs under their noses to mask the stench. Most learned to breathe shallowly. They operated in teams. One man would lower the bucket into the pit. Another would haul it up and transfer the contents to the cart. The process could take hours. Some pits hadn't been emptied in decades. A full night's haul might yield several hundred gallons of raw sewage. Cityscape. Neitzel economics, a dirty gold mine. Though despised socially, the Neitzel profession was surprisingly profitable. The reason? Fertilizer. Raw human waste mixed with ash or straw was valuable for farmers. Before chemical fertilizers, organic matter was essential to enrich depleted soil. Humanure, though risky, was effective. In London, nightsoil was transported to surrounding farms in Essex and Kent. In Paris, barges carried it down the Seine. The Dutch turned it into compost on reclaimed farmland. Because of this demand, established nightsoil men could charge fees for cesspit servicing, then sell the waste for additional profit. Some made enough to buy property. Others formed small companies with contracts and regular routes. This created a strange duality. They were both social outcasts and essential service providers. As one observer wrote in 1776, "They are the lowest men in speech and manner, yet the richest among the poor." The social stigma. Despite their importance, nightsoil men were widely reviled. Their odor clung to them long after the work ended. People crossed the street to avoid them. Some churches refused them burial in consecrated ground. Children insulted them with chants. Yet they formed tight-knit communities, often families or small guilds. They developed their own jargon, signals, and internal codes of honor. A few anecdotes stand out. In 1764, a London nightsoil man left a small fortune in his will to his son, with the condition that he never stoop to white-collar work. In Amsterdam, a nightsoil guild required members to swear not to gossip about what was found in cesspits, a reference to valuables, dead animals, and occasionally human remains. Many nightsoil men carried hidden knives or clubs. They worked in shadows, in dangerous neighborhoods with carts full of disease. But they persisted because the city needed them, even if it wouldn't say so aloud. Waxing crescent moon night shifts and urban rhythm. The nightsoil routes were so predictable that some cities planned around them. In parts of London and Dublin, nightsoil lanes were established routes wide enough for carts to pass. In Paris, waste was dumped into designated collection pits known as fosse descents, then removed by municipal crews. In smaller towns, the job was informal. One or two men made the rounds, often contracted by households or landlords. The work began after midnight and ended before dawn. During this window, they moved quickly, sometimes dumping waste into the river if collection points were blocked or frozen. There was competition, too. Freelancers, without licenses, often undercut official crews, sometimes stealing waste to resell as fertilizer. Fights broke out. In one case, rival crews sabotaged each other's carts by removing wheel pins. Even in waste, capitalism found a foothold. When things went wrong, nightsoil work was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Cesspit collapses were frequent. Soft walls gave way, swallowing workers whole. Some drowned in waste. Gas explosions occurred when methane built up. Several accounts describe nightsoil men burned as if by lamp oil. Contamination was constant. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery all spread through contact with human waste. Many workers died young. Despite this, few cities provided protections or pensions. The work was informal, loosely regulated, and mostly invisible. There were occasional exceptions. In the late 1700s, Berlin briefly offered hazard pay. In Vienna, a nightsoil tax funded rudimentary safety training, but these were rare. Mostly, nightsoil men disappeared the same way they worked, quietly, in the dark. The 19th century dawned with steel, steam, and revolution. But beneath the cobbled streets of Europe's greatest cities, another revolution was brewing, not one of politics or machines, but of waste. It would be a slow, clanging death knell for the nightsoil men. This story explores how modern sewage systems, flush toilets, and public health reform collided with the world of cesspits and honey carts. And as the ground quite literally shifted beneath their feet, the once essential guild of nightsoil collectors found themselves pushed further into the shadows until, eventually, they were gone. but not without resistance. Enter the flush toilet, a threat in porcelain. The invention of the flush toilet wasn't sudden, but when it arrived, it was seismic. Sir John Harington, a courtier of Queen Elizabeth I, designed an early version of a flushing water closet in 1596. But it was expensive and unreliable, and centuries would pass before the technology became viable on a large scale. The real turning point came in the early 1800s, when engineers like Alexander Cummings and Thomas Crapper, yes, his real name, developed improved designs using siphon systems, reliable valves, and better water pressure. Suddenly, flushing human waste away seemed not only possible but desirable. For the upper classes, the appeal was obvious. No more chamber pots. No more smells wafting from the privy. And crucially, no more interaction with Neitzel men. But these toilets needed one thing that many cities lacked: a sewer. Building the underground rivers. Most cities before the 19th century had no formal sewage infrastructure. Rainwater flowed through open gutters. Waste seeped into cesspits or was thrown into rivers. But as industrialization brought denser populations, and as cholera epidemics swept through European cities, public health officials began to panic. In London, the Great Stink of 1858 forced Parliament to halt proceedings, as the Thames became a toxic soup of waste and heat. The crisis led to the commissioning of Joseph Bazalgette, an engineer tasked with building London's first modern sewer system, a vast network of underground brick tunnels. In Paris, the Baron Haussmann's redesign of the city included extensive sewers beneath the grand boulevards, serviced by the now famous sewer workers égoutiers, a new breed of subterranean laborer. Hamburg, Vienna, and New York followed suit, each laying miles of pipe to carry human waste far from homes. This new infrastructure was a marvel and a threat. The Neitzel men, who once held monopolies on urban sanitation, now watched as entire cities rerouted their filth without them. Briefcase the sanitary movement and the end of informality. The rise of sewer systems wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a political and ideological shift. The sanitary movement, born in the mid-19th century, redefined how cities thought about cleanliness. Figures like Edwin Chadwick in England argued that poverty, disease, and filth were interlinked. His 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population helped galvanize support for municipal responsibility over waste. This movement called for government oversight of waste disposal, regular inspections of dwellings, the abolition of private cesspits in favor of public sewers, and crucially, the professionalization of sanitation. Suddenly, the Neitzel man, once a self-employed, if stigmatized, figure was out of sync with the new world of uniforms, rules, and state bureaucracy. Stop sign resistance from below. Not everyone welcomed the new sewer systems. Landlords balked at the cost of installing flush toilets and connections. Some feared damage to buildings or displacement of tenants, but most vocal were the Neitzel men themselves. In Dublin, a loose association of Neitzel haulers protested the closure of cesspits, arguing that flush toilets wasted water and damaged crops by reducing access to fertilizing waste. In Yorkshire, several independent collectors staged blockades, refusing to allow sewer work to proceed unless compensation was granted. In France, rural haulers who depended on city waste for fertilizer lobbied to preserve manual collection systems. These protests failed, but they offer a glimpse into the economic web. The Neitzel trade once sustained a web that included urban poor, rural farmers, builders, and even herbalists who used waste for composting rare plants. Scull a dangerous trade in decline. As the profession declined, its risks only grew. Without steady income, many Neitzel men turned to more desperate methods. stealing waste from still active cesspits, breaking into abandoned privies in derelict homes, raiding urban slaughterhouses and markets for organic material to sell as fertilizer. Some tried to pivot, becoming sewer workers or garbage collectors. Others refused to change, insisting that their work was more natural than underground pipes. But by the late 1800s, few remained. Newspaper ads no longer featured removal of nitzel services. City contracts went to sanitation companies. Cart-based collection was replaced with underground flows, and soon, only a handful of nitzel men, mostly in poor or remote areas, remained in operation. Globe showing Europe-Africa, the global picture. Though Europe moved rapidly towards sewer systems, other parts of the world followed different timelines. In Japan, human waste remained a valuable commodity well into the 20th century. Urban collectors hauled nitzel to surrounding rice farms, often bartering for produce in return. Even after World War II, this exchange continued in some regions. In India, manual scavenging, the collection of waste from non-flush latrines, remained widespread, often enforced through rigid caste systems. Despite legal bans, the practice continues in some areas today, underscoring how the legacy of nitzel collection can carry deep social scars. In China, nitzel was collected in honey wagons and applied to fields as a nutrient-rich slurry. Mao-era reforms emphasized sanitation campaigns, but humanure remained part of rural farming practice for decades. In all cases, the transition to modern sanitation was uneven and still incomplete in many places. The Guild of the Nitzel Men may have faded in the West, but its echoes remain global. Candle legacy in disguise. Though the name Nitzel Man disappeared, elements of the profession survived. Sewer workers, often considered heroes of public health, inherited many of the same risks and stigmas. Sanitation departments adopted nighttime shifts, protective gear, and specialized tools, descendants of the nitzel toolkit. Fertilizer industries began processing organic waste on industrial scales, turning what was once hand-shoveled into a global commodity. Even the term honey wagon, a nitzel cart, survives in modern RV and event sanitation, where waste is collected from portable toilets. And in some small towns, family names trace back to ancestors who once shoveled in the dark, quietly sustaining cities that never wanted to see them. So, as the gaslights flickered out and modern sewage swept in, one can't help but wonder, did we lose something in the transition, some forgotten resilience, some unspoken respect for those who cleaned while we slept? The carts are gone, the honey buckets retired. The echoes of wheels scraping cobblestones have long since faded into the urban din. But if you know where to look in alley names, public health ordinances, even the scent of ammonia in fertilizer, traces of the nitzel men remain. Their legacy, though buried, is foundational. In this final section, we'll examine how these unsung sanitation workers helped shape public infrastructure, forced societies to reckon with waste, and left behind a cautionary tale. What happens when vital labor is too easy to ignore? The nitzel workers' disappearing act. By the early 20th century, in most Western cities, the nitzel trade had been all but eradicated. Flush toilets and sewers were not only available, they were marketed as symbols of modernity, progress, and dignity. Households that had once relied on private collectors were now connected to municipal waste systems. The shift was swift. London, after Bazalgette's sewers, rapidly banned most forms of manual collection. Paris introduced fines for private cesspit use as early as 1904. New York City banned nitzel dumping within city limits in 1910, criminalizing informal waste workers overnight. What happened to the people who once did this work? Some were absorbed into new sanitation departments, albeit in more regulated, supervised roles. Others were pushed into unemployment or informal sectors, rag picking, ash hauling, coal delivery, or chimney sweeping. A few rural collectors clung to their trade into the 1940s, especially in places where sewers hadn't reached. But most disappeared without ceremony. Their tools were burned, their trade names forgotten, their stories, if remembered at all, were reduced to punchlines or euphemisms. Scroll the laws they inspired. Despite their erasure, Neitzel men influenced key aspects of modern urban governance. 1. Sanitation codes. Cities introduced ordinances defining how and where human waste could be disposed. These laws were direct responses to the chaos and the necessity of the Neitzel trade. Examples include mandatory cesspit inspections, licensing of collectors, permitted disposal sites and distances from wells or homes. 2. Public health departments. The unpredictability and health risks associated with unregulated waste removal led to the rise of centralized health boards. In many cities, these departments were born out of cholera crises, directly linked to contaminated water from cesspits and human waste runoff. 3. Labor safety laws. Though primitive, some early protections for dangerous jobs were lobbied for in the wake of deaths among Neitzel men, especially in Germany and the Netherlands, where unions advocated for recognition of sanitation labor. National cultural echoes. Even today, the legacy of the Neitzel men lingers in surprising places. Street names and sayings. Dung Wharf, Night Cart Alley, or Soper's Row are real street names in cities like London and York, marking old routes and dumping sites. Phrases like slop job or muckraker have roots in waste collection. Open book literature. Charles Dickens frequently referenced the stink and chaos of London's underclass, many of whom worked jobs like waste hauling. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables features detailed descriptions of the Paris sewers, including workers whose roles mirrored those of the Neitzel guilds. Performing arts, theater, and humor. Victorian stage plays often used nightmen as comic characters, smelly, drunk, and uncouth, an unfair caricature of the real, often sober and disciplined crews. Collision when sanitation fails. Modern cities don't think much about waste until the systems break. But when they do, we get glimpses of a world that Neitzel men once managed every night. In 2005, New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina shut down sewer systems, and human waste once again flooded neighborhoods. Volunteers hauled portable toilets into the streets, mimicking old Neitzel routines. In 2018, Cape Town, South Africa, came close to day zero, a complete water shutoff. Temporary bucket toilet systems had to be deployed in informal settlements. During the COVID-19 pandemic, sanitation workers were rebranded as essential, a modern version of the invisible labor once done in the shadows. These events remind us that cleanliness and public health are not guaranteed by engineering alone. They require human hands. Hands that once held buckets, not tablets. Repeat button A. Return to humanure. In recent decades, as environmental awareness grows, there has been renewed interest in composting human waste. Yes, we are once again talking about humanure. Composting toilets, increasingly popular in off-grid homes and eco-villages, replicate aspects of the old Neitzel model. Waste is collected, processed, and returned to soil. Ecological sanitation projects in parts of Africa and Asia reintroduce dry latrine systems, with scheduled collection, often by modern equivalents of Neitzel workers. Permaculture advocates now train people in safe waste composting, drawing on ancient and historical practices. What was once seen as primitive is now reframed as sustainable. And in doing so, the Neitzel man is remembered not as a relic, but as a pioneer of circular sanitation. Final reflections, unseen yet essential. In every generation, there are workers whose roles are so foundational that society prefers to ignore them. The Nightsoul men were among these. They touched what others refused to see. They kept cities breathing, even when cities disrespected them. They toiled through filth so others could walk clean streets in daylight. They were the hidden arteries of public life. And in forgetting them, we risk forgetting a truth that echoes across history. Civilization doesn't begin with kings, art, or warfare. It begins with plumbing. And behind plumbing then and now are the people who handle what others flush away.